If you care about the hidden mechanics of survival in history, subscribe to Legacy of Survival right now and, well, share this channel with someone who thinks they already know World War II. This isn't surface-level nostalgia or recycled victory garden talk. What you're about to hear is about quiet, deliberate food production that survived bombing campaigns, ration inspectors, and occupying forces. These gardens were not symbols. They were systems, and, understanding them gives modern survivalists and historians something practical that most documentaries never touch. Let's begin with why this matters. World War II created a global food crisis that was not solved by slogans. Civilians had to grow food without attracting attention, without revealing abundance, and honestly, without looking like they were doing anything unusual. The most successful backyard gardens were invisible by design. They blended into normal life, hid calories in plain sight, and avoided patterns that could be exploited. That logic is as relevant today as it was in 1942. Why invisibility mattered more than productivity in wartime gardens. During the war, visible abundance invited problems. In Britain, Germany, occupied France, and Eastern Europe, food production that looked too efficient raised suspicion. In cities under rationing systems, administered by entities like the Office of War Information, or under campaigns such as the British Dig for Victory, surplus food often attracted inspections, confiscation, or theft. The smartest households didn't aim to maximize yield per square foot. They aimed to look ordinary while quietly feeding themselves. For modern application, this means designing food systems that don't announce themselves. Mixed plantings, non-uniform layouts, and crops that resemble ornamentals remain effective today for anyone concerned with discretion. How, you might wonder, did ornamental landscaping quietly become calorie storage? Across Britain and, parts of Europe, flower beds were actually repurposed into food sources that still looked decorative. Kale varieties with purple leaves charred with those striking red stems and climbing beans trained over trellises designed for roses all served double duty. These gardens, you see, passed casual inspection while providing both vitamins and calories. A practical takeaway here is, quite simple. Choose edible plants that resemble ornamentals and, importantly, avoid straight planting rows. Blend food crops into decorative spaces so that productivity is, in fact, hidden by aesthetics. So let's talk about how hedgerows and fence lines became these sort of, linear food systems. Hedges were not just boundaries, in rural and suburban areas, they actually served as extended food banks. Gooseberries, currants, hazelnuts, and even espaliered fruit trees were carefully trained along existing property lines, and honestly, from a distance, nothing looked unusual at all. This approach, interestingly, still works today by using fences and borders for perennial food production. It really maximizes space without changing the visible function of the yard, which is quite clever if you think about it. Now, why were root crops so highly favored? Well, it's because they couldn't be seen or seized easily. Potatoes, turnips, parsnips, and beets absolutely dominated these invisible gardens, since the food was all underground. Even if authorities or neighbors happened to see the garden, they couldn't easily assess just how much food was actually there. Many families, harvested selectively, leaving crops in the soil as living storage. For modern survivalists, this really reinforces the value of root crops as both concealment and preservation. The idea is simple: harvest only what you need and leave the rest hidden. How laundry yards and drying areas doubled as growing zones. In dense urban housing, especially in Germany and in occupied cities, laundry yards were quite common. Households would plant low-growing greens, onions and herbs beneath clotheslines. Inspectors saw laundry, but families saw food. Today, this translates into growing food in multi-use spaces where activity is expected, such as patios, walkways, or utility areas. So, why did mixed livestock disguised as pets actually matter? Well, rabbits and chickens were often framed as pets rather than, obvious food sources. Hutches were kept small, tidy, and placed close to homes to avoid any suspicion. And interestingly, waste from these animals was used to feed compost piles, which in turn nourished the gardens. The real lesson here is all about scale and integration. Small livestock systems that look domestic, rather than, let's say, overtly agricultural, are just much easier to protect and sustain, especially during challenging times. Now, let's talk about how window boxes and balconies became urban lifelines. In cities facing aerial bombardment, backyard space simply didn't exist. So people grew lettuce, scallions, and herbs in window boxes. Balconies, meanwhile, supported tomatoes trained to grow vertically. These spaces were, quite frankly, overlooked precisely because they were everywhere. And even today, this strategy remains one of the most accessible forms of hidden food production for folks living in apartments. Why staggered planting prevented visible harvest events? Large harvest days attracted attention, So families planted in staggered intervals, meaning food matured continuously rather than all at once. Nothing looked abundant at any single moment. Modern gardeners can apply this by avoiding synchronized planting schedules and instead rotating crops quietly. How composting was hidden as waste management. Compost piles were framed as trash control, not soil enrichment. Food scraps, ash, and garden waste were blended gradually to avoid odor or volume that might draw questions. Even today, discrete composting remains essential for self-sufficiency without signaling productivity. What these invisible gardens teach us about survival thinking. These gardens were not hobbies. They were quiet resistance, engineered around human behavior, not just soil science. They prove that survival often depends less on how much you grow and more on how well you hide the fact that you're growing at all. If you value this kind of grounded, historically accurate survival knowledge, subscribe to Legacy of Survival, share this video with serious history buffs, and keep this channel alive. These lessons weren't meant to be forgotten, and with your support, they won't be.